Hello chess friends and welcome to Jozarov chess channel and welcome to a very special game that I decided to share with you today. It's again a brilliant game played by Stockfish against another top engine Ruby from the TCEC competition, from the recent TCEC league format that it's now played, and parallelly to this event also the computer chess championship is played. But I decided to show you more this TCEC competition games because in my opinion they are better. I'll explain you why. Because in this computer chess championship there are simply too many pre-arranged moves. I think the pre-arranged lines is simply too much better for one particular engine, and then the Stockfish engine, for instance, is brutalizing its opponent in an early stage of the game. In this TCEC competitions, on the other hand, the pre-arranged line is more equalish. That's why I like more, as I mentioned also before, this TCEC competitions, in which we can really study the normal openings like the Rui Lopez Italian game, I don't know, Queen's Indian defense, Nimzo Indian defense. So the really the most often and most popular opening that are played now these days. So that's why I wanted to show a really brilliant game from the TCEC competition, in which Stockfish had to play against the so-called Queen's Indian defense. And the Queen's Indian defense is a very popular approach of blacks. For instance, Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, Fabiano Caruana, all of the top grandmasters of these days are sometimes, of course, not always, are sometimes playing the Queen's Indian defense as a good response to d4. So there are many sidelines, many opportunities for white and for black. So that's why I decided to show more and more of this opening, and especially when Stockfish is playing this opening, it's of course then a brilliant game. So let's check out now this game. Here Stockfish opened with the move d4. We have knight to f6 by Rubichess, knight to f3, e6, and after c4 we have now so far the counter the Nimzo or the anti-Nimzo Indian setup. We don't want to allow our opponent here to play the move bishop to b4. If that happens, still we have opportunities to cover with knight to d2 or bishop to d2. We don't risk, as I said, to play the move knight to c3, because then after bishop to c3 we could have a vulnerable pawn structure. We could have already weakened pawn structure on the c file. So that's why we're delaying the knight's move here. The knight on b1 move, we're playing simply anti-Nimzo Indian setup, as I said, with the move knight to f3. So here in the continuation of the game, Rubichess played the move b6, delays also. Here the situation, black always hopes that white finally plays with the knight on c3, then black can of course play the spinning idea and basically reach the Nimzo Indian defense. But here in the continuation of the game, many times you see this line, g3, again playing a little bit around. We don't want to play the move knight to c3 immediately. We're delaying the knight's move. That's the most important thing. And now after move bishop to a6, we have now here the normal line here with the move b3. So we have now reached really the most often and most popular line of the Queen's Indian defense. I like to play the Queen's Indian defense myself. I have prepared several lines in this particular opening line, so it's something that I play now recently. I play also the King's Indian, Nimzo Indian, and of course, if allowed, also here the Queen's Indian defense. I play sometimes even the Benoni defense. So these are basically my three most popular responses when it comes to playing against d4. So here after move b3, we have protected so far the c4 pawn here from white's perspective. Now comes this move bishop to b4, because now of course white can cover with the move knight to d2 or bishop to d2. The most popular line is the move bishop to d2 instead of the move knight to d2, because when you play knight to d2, then you risk this idea. Bishop to c3 is, I think, a very unpleasant move that you can face, and already you're in several positional problems. So that's why many times here bishop to d2 should be played. And now you see also this particular move very often in the Queen's Indian defense, bishop to e7. It comes maybe as a strange idea, because many of us, I think, would play simply the move bishop to d2. But now after queen to d2, knight to c3, I think that white can really gain a great setup in the center of the board, especially if white of course maybe pushes the pawn to e4. Then these three pawns could of course create a very important space advantage for white in the center of the board. So as I said, it's simply a line that's now very popular to retreat with the bishop. But you see now the bishop on d2 is also not on the best of places. Of course, it will be maneuvered further in the continuation of the game, maybe here to c3, to b4 if allowed, or maybe here to f4 or g5. So this bishop is not staying there forever. So it's as I always like to say, black lost the tempo in the opening stage, played already once with the bishop on b4, then retreated to e7, so it was sort of a loss of tempo. But of course white will lose also another tempo, because white has also played once with the bishop. Now in the next couple moves we can expect a new move by the dark square bishop. So here after move bishop to e7, we have now bishop to g2, c6. This is also the normal move, preparing now d5, getting the pawn structure symmetrical. Here this is now the most important goal of black, so you see now what I mean about it in a couple of more moves. Here after move c6, we have now bishop to c3, and this is now one of my preparations. Really, that's why I really decided to show you this game, because that's something that I play recently against the queens in the defense. It seems like a strange move to put your bishop again on c3, where it is a little bit blocked out by its own pawn. But the problem is now, if you play for instance knight to c3, then you can face this one. Bishop d5 will happen for sure, and now if you castle, of course castle can happen. Maybe you can play here c takes d5, c takes d5. We have reached now really such a symmetrical position in which I think black is even slightly better, because the problem is now you can't compete on the c file with the rook. The problem is this move bishop to a3 will many times happen, and you have to get your rook somewhere. You have to get it maybe to c2 or b1, so that's now a very tricky preparation here of black. So when you have already of course played the move b3, so that's why in my deeper understanding of this queen's Indian defense, I'm preparing now this move bishop to c3, because many times you see now also this continuation knight to e4 challenging the bishop. But you shouldn't be so worried about your bishop on c3, because it is such a bad bishop, and this knight on e4 is a great knight. So that's why you should basically allow your opponent here to give up his very powerful knight for your bad bishop on c3. So that's why many times you should simply not care so much about this attacking idea of black's knight to e4. Okay, you have attacked the bishop, and here Rubichess also simply took out. But now you see our knight comes with a tempo into the game, and now after a couple more moves we can play e4, and again we'll have a powerful pal for central control. Okay, it's still an open game, it can still be a dynamic game. Black has the bishop here, but I think the main advantage that we have here is of course the space advantage in the center of the board. So here I really like now to play white position. I've played several times this position myself. I really like to play it because at least I know what I'm doing now in the next couple moves. Meanwhile black has of developing problems. Black needs to still secure the king, has to play somewhere with the knight, and meanwhile we can expect an e4 immediately. This e4 move cannot be protected anymore by black. Even if you play d5, still we can play e4. That's the beauty of this opening line. So here in the continuation d5 was played by Rubichess, but now comes the tricky part, knight to e5. That's something that you should always memorize when you play these types of ideas. After move knight to e5, of course d takes e4 is not working, because knight to c6, knight to c6, bishop to c6, you get the fork here and you lose the rook. So that's why here after move knight to e5, castling was played by Rubichess, and now rook to c1, simply delaying a little bit the situation, getting the pieces more active, getting the pieces on the best square. So bishop to b4, attacking the knight. We have queen to d2 by Stockfish. Rubichess now finally competes on this long diagonal. What's maybe even open the position further with the move c5, because black needs to get a dynamic game with the bishop here. Black cannot play anymore a static game. Black cannot play anymore a positional game. Black needs this position to explode. Black needs really now an open center position, and that's exactly what white is not allowing here. That's why we can understand, I think, very easily this moves that Stockfish is playing. Rook to d1 is also a very serious threat, because if something gets cleared, if something gets opened, then the rook is already where the queen is. So you see Stockfish has a fast development, because black simply gave up here the knight on e4 for the bishop on c3. So it's now a perfect setup for a positional beast, for attacking beast like Stockfish is. Now look at this setup. Knight is centralized, knight on c3 is on a natural square, bishop on g2 is on a great diagonal, both rooks on very active files. The queen is already developed. The queen can change also the direction of the attack, can be included towards the queen side, towards the king side. So it's very flexible setup here for white. So we have knight to d7, knight to d3, kicking away the bishop, bishop to e7, and now h4. h4 very important, because it's not allowing maybe here the bishop to come on this diagonal, because it seems so, at least for me, that this bishop is a little bit out of of games. So it's this bishop, the dark bishop of black, is searching new opportunities in the game. So I think by playing bishop to g5 and then maybe afterwards bishop to h6, it will be a new perfect diagonal for the dark bishop. So h4, really brilliant move by Stockfish. Rook to c8, we have now e4. As I said, this move couldn't be anyone somehow protected by Rubichess. E4 happened anyway. The control of the center of the board was simply too much, I think, to handle here for black. You see everything is pretty much glued together, everything is aiming towards the center. So now E4 is really opening the center of the board. So we have now d takes c4, d takes c4, and the problem is now whatever black does, if black plays now c5, you will simply pass through with the move d5. If black plays maybe the move e5, then still the same position will happen with d5. You see, still we have, I think, a great opportunity to create to get our space advantage. And the cool part is still we can develop maybe even our light square bishop on h3, although in this structure maybe our light square bishop would be blocked out by its own pawns, but still with bishop to h3 we could find new opportunities to get the bishop into the game. So here after move b takes c4, we have now bishop to a6 again. Rubichess is trying to attack the center of the board, tries to attack the weaknesses, but now Stockfish plays a normal move, a simple move. Simple moves are of course sometimes even the best move. So knight to b2, protecting the pawn on c4, bishop to a3, attacking the knight, which is of course at protecting the pawn on c4. But now with knight to b1, again Stockfish manages to kick out the bishop out of the game. Again the bishop has to retreat to e7, and again the bishop doesn't have good activities. Even if bishop to f6 happens, still we can, I think, kick it away with the move e5. So really brilliant central control. Look at these three pawns, they are really dynamic in the center of the board. So here queen to e2, we have queen to c7, we have f4. Stockfish is simply pushing pawns now further, really great space advantage. We have now c5 and, as said, d5. So e takes d5 here. So far also great defense by Rubichess, because after e takes d5 it would be, I think, a perfect position if we could play the move c takes d5. It's not possible of course, but look at this position. Imagine this position maybe with the queen here on f2 or something, or an f3. This would be such a huge pawn storm that black, I think, couldn't handle. I think in this position, if the queen would be maybe on g4, f3, I don't know, somewhere else, this position is something to resign here for black. So that's why rook to d5 has to be played. You don't want to again take out with this pawn. E takes d5 creates now several weaknesses. You see also here maybe on the king side. Now getting these pawns connected like this with rook to d5, at least we can still play the move e5 and then maybe f5, getting these two pawns somewhere on the 5th rank and maybe attack black in the continuation of the game. So here knight to d5 was played, rook to d5, we have knight to b8. Great move also by Rubichess, searching for this opportunity because there is now a huge weak square in the center of the board in white position. So that's why here Rubichess is of course trying to maneuver the knight to c6 and then to d4. So we have now knight to c3, knight to c6, rook to d2. Now comes this idea, knight to d4, queen to e3, and now queen to d7, knight to d3, a brilliant move. This is now a critical moment of the game. Knight to d3 is of course sacrificing the pawn on c4, but now Stockfish had of course a deep tactical idea in mind, because here Rubichess accepts the challenge, plays now bishop to c4, but now with the move knight to e5 we get the fork against the bishop and the queen. You have to play queen to e6 in order to protect your bishop, but now with king to h2, this is now a brilliant move. Stockfish is threatening the move bishop to h3. The queen got a little bit decoyed here towards the square e6. Now you see this is a perfect x-ray potential attack here by Stockfish. Here Rubichess has to retreat with the bishop because the queen is a little bit overloaded to the defense of everything. So that's why bishop to a6, and now comes this idea, bishop to h3. And here Rubichess decides to give up the exchange, plays queen to d6, although f5 is a possibility, but f5 leads actually into such a complicated game now for black. Black is not good in this continuation because you get simply e takes f5, knight to f5 maybe here, then you get here knight to d5. We can of course attack the bishop immediately, because if you play this one first we get the check, then you have to move the king, and still we can take out then here the bishop, we can also take out here the rook, so it's not a good continuation here for black. So that's why here in the continuation bishop to d6 was played by would be a possibility, pardon me, here by Rubichess, but now I think a normal rook to e1 solves again all of the position problems, because again knight to e3 is not working, so you would be forced maybe to play something like here rook to e8, but now with queen to a3, a counter attack, this would be a brilliant position for white. There's simply too much tension here on the e file, on the d file. There is simply too much tension on this diagonal. You still have to lose another tempo here with the bishop, so it's a perfect setup again for white, although white lost the pawn, but it's a +1 evaluation here already for white. So here in the continuation of the game, bishop to h3, as said, here Rubichess decided to give up the rook for the bishop. Sorry, I messed this up. So let's go back to this position. Okay, here Stockfish simply took bishop takes c8. We have bishop takes c8, and now knight to d5, a perfect square, of course, for the knight. The bishop is hanging. There is again also the tension on the d file. So again, these two knights really are dancing really in the center of the board. Really a perfect setup here by Stockfish. So queen to e6, we have knight takes e7, queen to e7, knight to f3. Here normal ideas by Stockfish. Stockfish is trying to simplify the game by trading off more pieces. Knight to c6, e5. You see we have h6, now queen to e4, now queen to c4, again queen to e4, a couple of perpetuals, but now Stockfish gets a huge square for the rook on d6, very powerful rook. Now there are opportunities maybe in long term somehow, maybe even to play queen to e3 and then play maybe a sacrifice with rook to h6, queen to h6, then get maybe the knight somehow into the game. This is sort of a tactical idea that you have to calculate sometimes when you're on the attacking side, when you see that your opponent has already played a weakness in front of the king. So I would consider at least sometimes to just sacrifice the rook for the pawn here on h6. So far not possible, of course, but as a long-term tactic maybe it could work. So here rook to d6, so here knight to a5, we have rook to c3, knight to b7, and now simply Stockfish improves the position of his pieces. h5, very important move to stop a little bit also the progress of blacks. It's paralyzing a little bit the whole king side, because in one moment we could have expected maybe the move g5 that could split the pawn chain here of white, could maybe open the position, but now with the move h5 Stockfish stops also this idea. So here queen to h3 attacking the pawn, but now with knight to h4 everything is pretty much good together. This rook is protecting the g3 pawn, which is now of course the main weakness in white's position, but so far it's protected by white's rook. So bishop to b7, we have queen to f1, we have queen to e6, a check here on h1 doesn't bring you anything. You have of course opportunities to escape. You can maybe play one check again, but nothing special is going on. So after move queen to f1, we have queen to e6. We have now again this brilliant move rook to d6, queen takes a2. It's of course losing a pawn, but it doesn't matter so much, because after queen to e1 and knight to c4, we have a couple of rook moves. Again the queen gets on e6, but now with the move f5, finally Stockfish is getting this pawns mobile. The queen has to retreat, and now with king to h2 we want also to play this very powerful move e6. e6 would create of course a very powerful pass pawn on the e file. So here in the continuation we have a rook to e8, a rook to d1, we have c4, and now e6 here by Stockfish. A brilliant move, because if you play f takes e6 immediately, then you get rook to e3, and we have now a powerful attack here on the e file. You cannot take, of course, in the next move it's white then that can of course take out the pawn on e6 and have a comfortable endgame here, of course simply up the exchange. So that's why after move e6 we have knight to b3, we have now e7, we have king to h7, we have rook to e3, queen to f6, protecting now here the king side, and now in the continuation queen to c3. Again, a simplification idea by Stockfish. Stockfish wants simply to retreat to trade off the queens, because when that happens, of course, then it's a completely winning game. Here after queen to c3, rook to c3, we have rook to e7, but now rook to c4. At least Stockfish has also taken a pawn, and the problem is now one particular tactic that I think we should really understand now in the continuation of the game. The brutal tactic that Stockfish has prepared here is to play one of these rooks on the 8th rank, and then to play something like knight to g6, because after knight to g6 and f takes g6 we could have then f takes or h takes g6, and then it would be a checkmate. If you don't react, if the knight is here on g6 and maybe one of these rooks is on the 8th rank, then you could also risk this checkmate on h6. So this is now something that bothers black through the whole game. The space advantage that white has gained now on the king side is, I think, threatening always this checkmate. So that's why black's pieces, although when we watch material it's about equal, because of course black has a bishop and maybe here 2 pawns for 1 rook, but when we watch the activity of the pieces, it's not so good. The checkmate threat, I think, as I said, is simply too much to handle here for black. So rook to knight to c5, we have rook to d4, we have bishop to c6. Now comes this idea, knight to g6 is the serious threat. Here we have bishop to a4, we have rook to c8, knight to b7, and now rook to a1. Attacking the bishop, we have rook to e2, first a check, king to g1, bishop to b5, now rook to d1, and now rook to f8. We have now f6, and now rook to b8. Also, as I said, knight to g6 is an opportunity. It's not even making this position worse, because now pretty much black is forced to trade off the rooks, but even if that happens, then this rook comes very active into the game, so nothing special here for black. Black cannot defend anymore this position. So here after move rook to f8, as we said, f6, we have rook to b8 attacking the knight, and now bishop to c6. Now comes this idea, knight to g6. It was simply a different move order. We have now rook to e8, rook takes e8, bishop to e8, and now rook to e1. You see rook to e7 comes, both pieces are now attacked. Here we have b5. Now the rook comes behind, attacks simply the bishop. We have bishop to d5, g4, b4, we have rook to c8 threatening checkmate, so you have to cover with the bishop. Bishop to g8, knight to f8, we have now a new check, and now rook to b8 attacking the knight. You have to move, and finally this pawn is also taken. So it's not maybe easy to win the game immediately, but Stockfish improves the position in every move, takes out this pawn. You see now this is a weakness, so Stockfish will win the game, but you don't have to rush, of course, in such a beautiful endgame that you have here. So a5, again rook to b8, again you cannot move the bishop, you get checkmated, so this bishop is stuck. The knight is maybe the most flexible piece here, but it doesn't have support, so it's of course a completely winning game here for white. So here knight to c4, king to f2, we have a rook to a8, a3. Now the king is playing, of course. We have rook takes a3, knight to c4, and now rook to a8. Again, Stockfish now improves the position of the king, because that's the only piece that needs improvement, chasing the knight a little bit. Knight to b2, and now knight to f8. Again here a brilliant move, knight to e6. Now we're targeting this square. Maybe black can defend this checkmate threat for a while, but you cannot defend anymore the g7 square. So here in the continuation we have g6 by Rubichess, but Stockfish simply takes, h takes g6, knight to d3. We have rook takes d3. Here in the continuation we have bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and here Stockfish simply pushed the pawn further. And here after king to h5, in this position Rubichess resigns. So brilliant game, I think. Let's go back to this opening prep. I think it's something really worth the study, because here that's the position that I played many times. As I said, first b3, bishop to b4, really top grandmaster level lines that are very often and popular now these days. Bishop to b4, bishop to d2, and now bishop to c3. That's a line that you should remember. It is so far a bad bishop, but after move d5, for instance, that could be also a continuation. You can play simply knight to e5. Again, this idea is not working. D takes c4, knight to c6 will happen. Castling, and if you get challenged, as we said, you don't you're not scared because of this idea, because your bishop can be taken. If that happens, then you have a great symmetry. The pawn structure gets symmetrical, but the opportunity is then to push the pawn on e4, getting our space advantage like Stockfish did in the continuation of the game. And I think, as I said, it was a brilliant positional game here by the fish against the queens in the defense. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game like I did. I really like this game. It's really something that we should memorize in the near future. If you want to see more positional and attacking brilliances like this, Check out my commented chess games played by computer series with some more great games played by Stockfish, Alpha Zero, Lila Zero, and many more. And if you want to see humans battling it out in their best chess games, check out my commented chess games, the best chess games of all time series with some great games from the past. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.